Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don being joined again today by
Alexis.
Glad to have both of us here in the same room recording. We don't get to do that frequently.
Yeah, not virtually.
Yeah, so it's a special treat for us. And you also get, as we talked about a couple episodes ago, you get two people piloting the craft versus one, which we think is a big plus. So now we are in episode 3 of a 4-part episode. What are we focusing on, Lex?
Weather.
Weather. Weather has nothing to do with history.
Oh, yes, it does.
Yeah, as we've discovered up until now, we covered in 2 episodes ago the Spanish Armada and its impact from weather. The last episode we covered the saving of Washington in 1814 by a storm. In both instances, there weather was a player in the game. As Alexis teased at the end of last episode, what's different about our episode today?
Today's episode, the weather is the event in history.
Yeah, the weather is the event in history. In fact, the event that we're talking about in history still is recorded as the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history.
Yep.
And it's near and dear to both Alexis and I because of where we both were born and actually now where Alexis lives.
Yep.
And so many of you know that we are from the area of Texas, most predominantly known or identified with the big city of Houston. But Houston is a little bit inland from the Texas coast. If you're going to go to the quote-unquote beach, I use that term loosely for all of our listeners around the world. We have a beach, but it doesn't look like your beach for the most part. We'll put it that way.
It has sand.
It has sand.
By water.
Yeah. And the water occasionally is blue, perhaps.
Ish.
Yeah. But if I'm in Houston, I'm telling folks that I'm going to the beach for the day, where do they presume I'm probably going?
You were going 50 miles south to a little town called Galveston.
Galveston, Texas. And while it probably is a little more well-known globally than I imagine it is, I don't think probably everybody would even know that, especially if you're not a native Texan or if you're not from the United States. But Galveston is, as Alexis said, it's about, well, the city of Houston basically stretches into Galveston now. It's all one large metropolitan.
You can drive 4 hours from Houston to Houston.
Right, exactly. It's still a major metropolitan area. But Galveston is unique in that it is down on the Gulf coast, the Gulf of Mexico coast, and it's southeast of the city proper. And for most of us that are driving, particularly in where we live in the Houston area, we can be there in less than an hour, all things being considered. And it actually is where Alexis now
lives.
She lives in Galveston. So she lives away, but she doesn't live that far away. And Galveston is unique for a number of reasons, but one of the most interesting things about Galveston and its uniqueness is what, Lex? It's an island.
It is an island.
Yeah. And so when we talk about Galveston, we talk about the city of Galveston, but we're also normally talking about Galveston
Island.
And
then Galveston County.
Right. So the city of Galveston proper is not on the mainland, but it's actually on a small island that is very close to the mainland. It's separated by
2 miles.
2 miles. Today it's crossed by a roadway, a causeway that allows you to continue to drive directly off of the mainland, across the causeway and the bridges and onto the island itself. But in the time that we're going back to, there was no causeway.
Correct.
There was a railway that did cross over. But Galveston Island and the city of Galveston were separated from the mainland. And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking today about the Galveston that was, and I think more importantly, the Galveston that
is,
and the Galveston that could have
been.
Definitely could have been. And it's an interesting journey, and the key actor in that whole story about what was, what is, and what could have been is an event that happens in September of 1900 when Galveston is struck by the 1900 storm, the Great Storm of Galveston, is struck by a hurricane, and how that not only changed and altered the history of Galveston, it definitely did that. It altered the history of other cities, Houston and other parts of Texas, and it being argued altered or the destiny of other things that flow out from that. So today, on our episode of A Fork in Time, we're going to focus on the historical what if there had not been the great Galveston hurricane of 1900.
Would groceries delivered to you in as fast as 1 hour save you a trip to the store? Instacart makes that possible thanks to personal shoppers in your area who hand-select items based on your preferences from the stores you love. And shopping multiple stores is possible on a single order. Instacart picks the freshest produce and even keeps your eggs safe, all while finding everything you usually buy, providing smart suggestions for new items, and even highlighting deals to help you save money. And now you get free delivery on your first order over $35. Let Instacart know we sent you and help support our show by following the link in the show notes. Instacart. Groceries delivered in as fast as 1 hour.
So we mentioned that we are talking about the Galveston storm of 1900, the Great Storm of 1900. There's several different monikers that this storm goes by, but just some quick kind of bullet points about the storm. It was, in modern measurements, it was considered a Category 4. Of course, this was way before the time where we categorize storms and we name storms, but in modern equivalents, it was considered a Category 4 storm. And winds for the storm were averaging somewhere between 140 to 145 miles an hour. I've seen some different spans there, but very windy to get up to that Category 4 designation for what this storm was. And it made landfall early in the morning on Galveston Island on September 9th of the year 1900.
Okay. A couple of things here. I've mentioned before that I work for a company that focuses on weather, so a number of my colleagues are actually the tropical weather experts globally for the organization I work for. So one of the benefits that I have each and every day when I work is I get to talk to meteorologists of all ilks who are very skilled, but I particularly get to talk to our tropical weather meteorologists. And so I like to say that a couple of my colleagues there forget more every day about hurricanes than I will ever know, and that's probably a true thing. And any of them, probably should have invited one of them maybe to join us for this. That would have been an interesting thing to get their perspective on this. But one of the things I know because of doing what we do, we so often focus on tropical storms, tropical weather, hurricanes, by their wind fields. And Alexis mentioned the strength of the winds here. The storm, we're just going to call it the storm, the 1900 storm, because we don't have a name for it really. It's sometimes referred to as the Great Storm. You occasionally hear the term the West India
I've never heard that.
hurricane. I've heard that. Maybe that's because I get to hang around in meteorological circles. But it was a strong, by modern standards on the Saffir-Simpson scale, Category 4 storm. That scale that we use, that Category 1 through 5, this is for free. There will be no test at the end. Is purely based upon wind intensity. So we talk about Category 1, 2, 3, and 4 hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin. We're using a scale that focuses entirely on wind. Wind is a destructive thing. There's no doubt about that. And 135, 140, 150 mile an hour sustained winds are very serious factors. But the thing that was the most deadly about the Great Storm of 1900 was not just the wind, but it's the thing that accompanies a landfalling hurricane, and that's the storm surge.
Yes.
And so we're going to spend some time talking a little bit about the destruction today, and it'll also play to the historical what if, because one of the reasons this storm was so destructive is that at that time, Galveston basically is a very low, elevated barrier island that is directly exposed to the Gulf of Mexico.
Yes.
And so when the storm arrives, not only packing those sustained winds in the middle of the night, which is a scary thing, it's also bringing with it a very destructive force known as a storm surge, a wall of water that will surge over the island. And many of the folks who died did not die from being hit by debris. They did not die. They died by drowning. Because depending upon where you were on the island, we're not just talking about several feet of water, but tens of feet of water that came very quickly. The surf was exacerbated. a very, very, very precarious situation, again, also happening in the middle of the night. So when we talk about the intensity of the storm, don't just think wind. A lot of times when you think about hurricanes, you think wind, but the very dangerous aspect of the storm still is the very dangerous aspect of a storm today. All this is a public service announcement brought to you about tropical weather, is being aware of the storm surge. And the 1900 storm is a classic example of what an unchecked, strong storm hitting the coast in just the right way can do in terms of destruction and damage.
Yeah, we've talked, well, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but also the island was very flat. It was very close to sea level. So that was a problem before the storm. But then you have these tens of feet of water washing over the island, and the island was very, very low. So you have those sustained winds, you have a very low island, and you have walls of water washing over it.
And there have been a number of excellent books. There was a number of excellent documentaries. I'll actually try to find maybe some links to YouTube things, because this is one of those things better visualized perhaps than just described. But there's a book called Isaac Storm, which is somewhat famous for telling the story. It's named after I can't remember his last name now. He was the chief meteorologist for the National Weather Service Bureau there, whose first name was Isaac.
Yes, and I can't remember his last name either.
I want to say it's Isaac Klein. I'm going to look up here very quickly on the thing to see what's there, but it's referred to as Isaac Storm. Another great book was A Weekend in September, which also describes the events, because this happened early in September. But we won't spend as much time on the podcast today talking about the actual storm event itself. That is worthy of an entirely different treatment. Again, this is not the weather podcast. This is a historical what if podcast. So we want to talk about the historical what if of the 1900 storm. In order to put that in context, Alexis, it's important to understand what Galveston was before the storm. So, in broad terms, I know you live there now. I know you interact with the various historical agencies that are down there and what's going on. What was it like to be on Galveston Island, let's say, in late August of 1900?
It was booming. This period of history right before the storm is actually called the Golden Era of Galveston. So Galveston was very influenced by investors, very influenced by trade, of course, being in its position on Galveston Bay right close to the Gulf of Mexico. So a lot of trade was going through the city, and things like that. So it was a booming town before the storm kind of came and kind of wiped everything out. I mean, a lot of people were definitely seeing Galveston as the shining light of the future, so to speak.
It was the interesting to note at that time. This is 1900, the first electrification, the first electricity.
Telephones.
The first telephones in the state of Texas. They're not in Austin. They're not in Houston, which exists as a city, but nowhere close to what it is now. It's not in Austin, which was the capital. It's in Galveston. And in fact, if you go to Galveston today, and we would encourage you to do so, support what is our local tourism.
And it's a beautiful city.
If you're coming from elsewhere, again, the beaches,
yeah.
But there's interesting things to see that aren't the beaches there. One of the interesting things to see is along the main street through town, which is on Broadway. What do you find along Broadway in Galveston today?
You find several historical mansions that actually survive this storm.
We're talking about mansions.
Yes.
Now we're not quite talking about. Let's put this in perspective. We're not talking about like Newport.
No.
Rhode Island kind of mansions. That's a whole other, thing. Well, we're talking about buildings that deserve the designation for that age of mansions. There's a number of them. One of them is the Moody Mansion, which is probably well known there. There's another one that's actually called Bishop's Palace.
It's probably my favorite.
Yeah, which was actually given over to the Galveston
Archdiocese. Yeah.
Archdiocese, and so it became the residence for the bishop. Hence Bishop Palace, but it had been a private residence before. So all up and down the main street in Galveston, which is Broadway, you would find these very large
houses, yes.
Yeah, and you can still tour them today. They're available now. It's one of the more interesting things to do in Galveston, Texas. And again, as Alexis mentioned, Galveston is a thriving seaport. It's a rail connection back in. There are rails that do cross over on bridges and trestles from the mainland to the island. 70% of the cotton flowing through the area is flowing out to the port of Galveston. So it's a thriving seaport in 1900. It's beginning to rival other great seaports, and in some cases you might even argue surpassing other great seaports along the Gulf Coast. The ports of New Orleans. Mobile, Pensacola, these are all being rivaled by Galveston. Galveston is a city on the rise. Galveston is the city on the rise in the state of Texas. So literally a week before the storm, going down Broadway, you would have seen these newfangled thing called electric lights. The residents there would have had these things called telephones. There was wealth, there was prosperity. Galveston was a city on the boom. Fast forward a week.
Yep.
What do you have?
Decimation.
Yeah. How many people?
Roughly about, and again, there's estimates, but the number that I see cited the most is 8,000 people have passed away because of this storm. It varies. We go from around 6,000 all the way up to 12, but 8,000 is the most commonly cited number.
Yeah. So much so that I happen to have a degree in political science. I remember studying the sort of Galveston model. It's what's known as the commissioner's model that flows out of the destruction. The situation was so bad, and the need for the government of the city to reorganize just to deal with the most basic functions of cleanup. This includes the removal of bodies. This includes the removal of debris, getting back, feeding and taking care of those who had survived. That essentially an entire new sort of form of government that was unique to the time here of again, this is the dawn of the 20th century. The commissioner form of government, this idea of government not being elected but being more functional, bureaucratic, towards a purpose. The commissioner form of government, which exists actually in a lot of places inside the state of Texas today and other places, flows out of Galveston's political organization's response
to the storm.
The need for cleanup, debris removal, rebuilding. They basically had to reform the city's government to deal with the natural disaster. And this is in a time before there was federal aid and federal relief, although there was an outpouring of support and things that were there. But literally the population of the city, give or take, is somewhere, most estimates are around 35 to 37,000 people. So if you have, let's just use 7,000 as a broad number, somewhere around 1 out of every 5 citizens perished in the storm. It's a 20% roughly
decrease
mortality rate.
Yep.
Do we have natural disasters today with high mortality rates? Absolutely. It's hard to fathom that, and it all happened in the space of 24 to 36 hours. A lot of these were direct deaths. These were not the indirect deaths, which often happen in terms of natural disasters, although there certainly was that. So we go from Galveston being a city on the rise. It's the shining star along the Texas coast. It's the fastest growing city in Texas. We go from that to total destruction. And while Galveston exists today as a city, Galveston has a port today as a city. How would you describe Galveston relative to other cities in Texas today, Lex?
Definitely not the forefront that people think of. I think you mentioned ports. I think when people think port cities in Texas, they automatically think Houston, because Houston has a port. Galveston is not the first thing that pops into anybody's mind by any stretch of the imagination.
Right. And so, again, as we're now talking about, this is, of course, we are the What If podcast, not the What Did podcast. We've talked about what the city was. The historical what ifs to me of Galveston without the 1900 storm is, would the trajectory that Galveston was on had continued? And if that trajectory had continued, and the only reason it was interrupted is the arrival of this horrifically devastating hurricane, how would things have been different? The what if is, how would not just Galveston have been different, but what would have been the impact around because of Galveston being different? So when I asked that question, Alexis, you already mentioned, what's some of the first thing that pops into your head?
So the first thing that pops in my head is, we've mentioned that Houston is a city at this point, but it's not the city that we know of today. It's not the city you and I both grew up in, born in. So if you have no Galveston storm, you have no Galveston being completely decimated. Does the growth from Galveston continuing on this upward trajectory, does Galveston kind of spread northward and spread inward so that Houston kind of gets eclipsed, and we could have been growing up in Galveston, but Galveston, as it was the bigger city, because it had kind of grown and prospered and kept going, it kind of overtook and encompassed Houston because Houston was the weaker city
Right.
at the time.
I think to me that's the most obvious what if, is that the rise or the continuation of Galveston would have come at the expense of something else.
Right.
And so the most logical thing, because of their closeness in terms of geography and how they, we sometimes refer to the Houston Galveston area now. Galveston, yes, it's a separate city. It's in a separate county. It's 50 miles. From parts of Houston, it's 70, 80 miles away.
Right.
But still, it's close. It's the greater Houston-Galveston area. We said we'd be talking about today about the greater Galveston, fill in the name of another, city. Houston today, without getting off into, mapping of the Houston area, especially if you're listening somewhere outside the United States, what do you care, right? There are very large suburban areas that are around the city of Houston, very large cities that standing on their own, a large city, Sugarland, Pearland, Katy, the area that's known as the Woodlands. These are all very large. If you just set them out separately, if you could pick them up, lift them up, and set them down, would be very large cities. They're part of the greater Houston area. Imagine that instead Houston is one of those types of cities to the north of Galveston. There's a city called Conroe that's about the same distance north of Houston that you might argue that Houston is north of Galveston. So would in modern terms, would Houston be Galveston's Conroe? If we were, just to put that in perspective for those of you that are from the area and realize that, that's one way that I think of it, is how that would have played out. And I think Alexis hits upon a very key point. Houston has one of the largest ports in the world today. It's a port. That port is unique in that it's actually an inland port.
Yep.
It's removed. Galveston is at the foot of Galveston Bay, which is a fairly large but fairly shallow bay. The average depth of Galveston Bay is something around 6 feet.
Yeah, it's not very deep.
Not very deep. And it's fed, at least on one side, by, we have a lot of these in the Houston area called bayous.
Or bayous.
Bayous, whatever you want to call them. Sometimes referred to as the Bayou City. One of those happens to be a large bayou called Buffalo Bayou, which runs through downtown Houston today, proceeds out to the east, but in the 1920s and into the 1930s, that bayou underwent a tremendous transformation as a result of a federally funded project and the Army Corps of Engineers turning it into not just a bayou, but turning it into the quote-unquote ship channel. And the Houston Ship Channel actually begins, or technically the Houston Ship Channel runs through the middle of Galveston Bay. Mm-hmm. The center portion of the bay has been dredged out, and there's a narrow lane that's deep enough for large tanker traffic and container traffic that runs directly up the middle of this very shallow bay marked by buoys and markers, progresses up into the enlarged, expanded bayou, and then up to the port itself. The proper part of the port of the city of Houston, which actually is not far from where I grew up at all and where I live today, is some 50 to 60 miles inland from Galveston. And the port of Galveston. By far, the port of Galveston is a large port today, but by far the port of Houston dwarfs the traffic for the port of Galveston.
Definitely.
So Houston, as a major metropolitan city, one of the largest cities in the United States, one of the largest and fastest growing cities in the entire world, is greatly driven by its port. So one of the immediate what-if arguments is, if there was still a big port in Galveston,
why do we need a port in Houston?
Yeah, and so what do you think about that?
I think there's two scenarios. One, there's never a port in Houston built. I think there also could have been this scenario of it. They're almost like sister ports. It's like Galveston is the much bigger port, and there's kind of this secondary helper port, for lack of a better term for it, I guess, in Houston, where Galveston is taking the majority of the traffic and the majority of the ships, but Houston is kind of this overflow port, so to speak.
Or where things that are unloaded at Galveston are transferred to smaller vessels or transferred to rail or whatever they're transferred to and begin to work their way in. And they pass through Houston after they've passed through the port of Galveston. I could certainly see that scenario. So when you look at things that way, you have a big scenario where, again, Galveston is a much larger city. In my mind, the easiest way for me to imagine this, what would have happened if Galveston had not been devastated by the hurricane, the easiest thing to imagine is that sort of, as we've already talked about here, the fates of Galveston and Houston would have been switched or flopped. And so Houston would be this subsidiary city to Galveston in much the way that Galveston is now a subsidiary city to Houston. Would you agree with that point of view, Lex?
Definitely.
Okay. That, I think, is the easiest way to think that through. Now, there still may have been the desire to build this more inland section of that port. The port of Galveston may have just grown north up the bay, and then eventually, as it is now, and they may have eventually widened out the bayou into the ship channel as we know it today, especially with the rise of the petrochemical industry and the things that came after that. So you still may have a similar type of port complex, but again, I think it would be called the port of Galveston. And so it would be a very different thing there. There are things that arise, though, inside the city of Houston that I wonder sometimes whether they would have arisen to the city of Galveston. One of the other things that maybe a lot of people do know, Houston is known for its, among other things, it's certainly known for it being a port. It's known for being the space city. First words from the moon were
Houston.
Well, at least that's the first words that we heard from the moon. I have a theory that off mic, Neil and Buzz did a big wahoo, we've landed. But the first ones that we hear are Houston. We're familiar with that. You know, maybe the title of this episode is going to be Galveston, we have a problem. You know, instead of the famous, Apollo 13 line referring to mission control, which is actually not even technically in Houston. In fact, it's almost closer to Galveston when you think about it. But
yeah,
going along that whole line, Houston is known for all things. Houston is also well known for having a very large medical center. Mm-hmm. In fact, the medical center here in Houston is, if you were to break it out, I remember seeing this statistic or hearing this delivered in a presentation probably a decade ago. The office space in the Houston Medical Center area, if you broke it out to be its own unique downtown in the United States, would be the 9th largest downtown in the United States by the just office space footage. Some 250,000 people go to be treated and work each day in the Houston Medical Center.
One of them is my mom.
Yeah, exactly.
That's wife.
And so Houston is well known for the Houston Medical Center. Would there have been a Galveston Medical Center in terms of the what ifs that were there? Yeah,
and definitely there is a hospital down in Galveston. There's a medical school down in Galveston. My mom went to medical school in Galveston, and it's funny. UTMB, University of Texas Medical Branch, is the school and hospital that's down in Galveston. As we're still in the midst of this COVID thing, my mom made the comment at the beginning of it, and she's like, if you're gonna get sick somewhere, Galveston's a pretty good place to get sick. It's a research hospital. So she was like, I actually feel okay that you're living in Galveston at the time. So I think that's not a far stretch of imagination to imagine that we have a Galveston Medical Center instead of a Houston Medical Center if Galveston continues this upward trajectory because there's no storm.
Right. And of course Galveston was the fast-growing, metropolitan, sophisticated city of Texas as well. I mean, for example, if you go and tour those mansions that we talked about, we mentioned that they had electrification, we mentioned that they had telephones.
The word is opulent.
They are opulent. Bishop's Palace, which is a beautiful structure. It's a beautiful structure. These were, they weren't quite Newportish kind of mansions. I use that as an example, but they were opulent. These were wealthy folks. These were wealthy traders that lost their fortunes very quickly as a result of what happened with Galveston. So, again, the immediate easy thing to think through is this scenario of the what if of Galveston continues to be on the rise, and if Galveston is on the rise, it eclipses its sister city to the north, Houston, and changes things in a way there. To me, that's the easy what if of the 1900 storm. I think there's a more interesting concept to think about for the 1900 storm, which is it's not the case that Galveston has only ever been hit by one
Oh, definitely not.
hurricane. So one of the things that runs through my mind, I want to hear your thoughts first. We didn't even talk about this off podcast. We're all getting this in the real time. What do you think would have happened if there's no 1900 storm, but other storms have come later? Most notably, much later, there was a storm in the 20s, but more lately in history here, a storm called Hurricane Ike, which happened in 2008. So imagine the scenario where there's no 1900 storm, but eventually Galveston at some point in its future. I'm going to look up here when the Galveston hit was. I want to say it was in 1928. It'd be really helpful to have my colleague Chris Aber here right now because he could tell me that in a second. But imagine that it's hit by a later hurricane. What difference do you think that makes?
One of the things that struck me particularly about Ike is, and we can get into this a little bit too. So after the 1900 storm, this thing called the seawall is built, basically in an effort to raise the island up, because one of the things that was majorly affected was the storm surge. So we were raising the island up so we wouldn't be as affected by a storm surge. Even in Hurricane Ike, which was 2005, if you go into some of the buildings which are downtown Galveston on the Strand, they have plaques in the buildings that show you what the water line was for 2005, and that's after we've raised the island by 17 feet with that seawall.
And when you say raise the island, we've raised the entire
the 29-mile long island we have raised by 17 feet. And even in 2005, with Hurricane Ike, you have these plaques in downtown Galveston, which was completely decimated in 1900 and had to be rebuilt. You have these plaques showing you where the water line was. So even that shows you that even after we've raised the island significantly with the seawall, you still had this water getting in. So it's interesting to think about if they hadn't had the 1900 storm and were still kind of that low-lying island that we think about that they were before the 1900 storm. If you have a storm coming through that even had a worse storm surge, because clearly that storm surge in Ike was much worse. So if you have a storm coming through that even has a worse storm surge and worse destructive impact, would it be possible that the island would have even become almost more far gone and not able to bounce back with the worst storm surge?
I think about that. I think it was 1915 when they had a storm that was of some comparable nature there. I'll sort of confirm that. I'll definitely put some notes in the show notes because I don't want to go searching for it now. Would have been I'd done that research before, but can't lay my hands on the research right now as we're recording. But I think it's an interesting point. Imagine, first of all, it was the loss of life with 37,000 residents in 1900 was a lot. Mm-hmm. Somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000. But if we settle in on the 7,000 or 8,000 number that I see most common, imagine by 1915 where the city has grown more.
Yep.
Substantially more. That so now it's a city maybe of a population of 50,000, approaching 100,000. More large buildings have been built. More commerce is there. It's a city that's thriving.
Yep.
So imagine that city gets hit by a storm. Again, without the seawall, without the raising of the island that has taken place. If you imagine that scenario, the potential loss of life...
Much greater.
Much greater. You easily could have a loss of life that easily stretches into the tens of thousands of residents, and the destruction of property being even more so deadly. In fact, if we think about people that may have been trapped on higher floors of now buildings that have grown up in terms of their height, all the things that go with that. To me, one of the interesting what-ifs is it's easy to say, well, if there's no 1900 storm, and you almost assume, well, it dodged the one bullet that was ever fired at it.
Nope.
Which is not true. And so if there's no 1900 storm, I think one of the immediate places that you tend to go and have to think about is it was inevitable. It would have been inevitable. It was inevitable.
A storm was going to hit the island.
Yeah. And so if a storm hits the island, once it's had the chance to grow more without having endured the tremendous hardship and the things that were done after the 1900 storm that we know of at Galveston today, you could have had a scenario when we talk about, we may not talk about the Great Storm of 1910, we may talk about the Great Storm of 1915.
Right.
And we talk about it in even more destructive terms than we do about the storm of 1900. Now, of course, eventually you do have some of the benefits coming along. One of the things that made the 1900 storm so bad is meteorological capabilities. Satellites don't exist. Advanced warning doesn't exist. Today I'm fortunate enough to work for a company, but you don't even have to work for a company that has access to the resources that mine does to know when you're at risk for tropical weather. We have these things called satellites. We have these things called hurricane hunter planes. We have all these resources that we use so that, yes, you can actually, interesting enough, you can have surprising events happen with tropical weather in terms of the intensity being a late-minute thing or the last-minute shift in track. But being totally surprised by a hurricane was the phenomena for many people of 1900. In fact, one of the interesting things about the books that you'll read is the failure, and his last name was Klein, of the National Weather Service person there to really... He should have seen some signs that were indicating something was going to happen. But being surprised by a storm of that intensity doesn't happen today. There were still periods of time, not quite down to today, where you could have been surprised by this. And so for me, one of the historical what-ifs is how inevitable was it that Galveston was going to ultimately take a major hit from a major devastating hurricane. As a coastal city along the Gulf Coast where it's located, it wasn't a question of a what if, it was going to be a what when. And so, whether that's 1915 or a subsequent storm, or even down to Hurricane Ike in 2008, or...
I said 5 earlier, it was 8.
2005, another big year.
Another big storm.
Yeah, another big year. But to me, it's not a question of would it have happened. It would have happened, but what would it have meant? And again, without the benefits that were derived from building a seawall, from raising the height of the island, from having modes of getting off the island that exist now that didn't exist, all the things that have happened, plus the improvements in technology.
Right. Yeah, that was a big thing after the storm hit. It obviously knocked out those rail lines that we were talking about that connected the island to the mainland. So you even had, even after the storm hit, you even had problem getting word to the mainland that something had happened, because people in Houston were like, yeah, it was gonna rain a little bit, but I think they'll be fine. And then a couple days later it was like, oh, this is bad.
Right. And in fact, one of the things I think that's interesting to note is that we often hearken back to the 1900 storm. I mentioned how much better technology and meteorological support, all the things that happen now, but it's because of thinking back to what it's like to not have that type of thing that technology came along, science came along, and things were allowed, but people were thinking in terms of we need to have ways to detect and to know and to track. So I think one of the things that actually happened as a result of the 1900 storm, one of the positive things that the what if does not negate, is that there was an advance in the science and the realization that there needs to be a better method for dealing with the fact that these threats are real, because Galveston was not the first coastal city to be struck by a major hurricane. It was not going to be the last, and so there needs to be something that's better put in place to deal with the scenario.
Right.
In fact, there's a couple of other interesting, I'll throw them in here because they sort of aren't really the what ifs, but they fit well. One of the last major responses by the founder of the American Red Cross, Claire Barton, was to the actual event there in 1900, and we talked a little bit about the historical what if. We talked about the fact that it was because of Galveston's devastation that helps Houston rise. It's in 1901 that the Spindletop discovery happens for oil, and so when it's time to have a port that's going to support that, Galveston is gone. So you might argue that even if the historical what if had only been a few more years to let Galveston's port start to be energized by the elements of the early days of oil and the things that are related around oil export and production, that might have caused a different scenario in terms of it being rebuilt or coming back. But of course, once Galveston is gone, it's actually in as early as 1909 that the work begins on the Houston Ship Channel, and what happens there is such that by the time we reach the First World War, again, Galveston is existing as a city, and it's begun to rebuild. In fact, it almost has a little renaissance actually in the 1920s and beyond, but it's nowhere close to coming back to what it was before. It missed its
its heyday.
It missed its chance after its high point, and it did that because of the storm in 1900. So I think the most obvious what if there was no 1900 storm is the one that's maybe easiest to overlook. Thousands and thousands of people lost their lives.
Yes.
So if we take a median-ish type number there, let's say 7 or 8,000 again. If you think that down, that's now what, 4 generations?
Yeah,
Give or
roughly.
take? We're probably talking here, just of the descendants from those 8,000 people, we're probably talking about 50, 60, 100,000 people?
I think that's conservative, yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I think that it's easy to forget because we too often, the reason I wanted to mention this, too often when we on the podcast we talk about the broad macro sweeps of world history. I can't say for sure. I'm sure I probably have met somebody, but I can't think of anybody that immediately comes to mind who had a relative that I know, even though we're so close geographically to this, who lost their life. My great-grandfather died in the...
Yeah, in the 1900 storm.
I have no doubt that I know people who can make that claim. We probably just never, that subject's never been directly broached. But, when you start thinking that through, okay, what were the big impacts on Galveston or Houston or the economy or ports or all of this? That's great to talk about. That's sort of interesting. But the realization here that there's probably 100,000 people
that don't exist
or were directly impacted by that historical what if. I know we are guilty so often because again it's easy when it's hundreds of years ago to talk about these big broad sweeps of history to forget that it's the individual stories.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me is, again, I live in Galveston, so I kind of live with this event pretty much every single day of my life in some aspect. And I remember some friends of mine and I were in downtown Galveston. We walked into a building that was built relatively close. Actually, it's a building that survived the storm. And we're in the first floor of this building. And we're looking at these photos, and a lot of the buildings that survived ended up being morgues. And so we're looking at these photos, and one of my friends who was with me, it kind of clicked in her mind as she's looking at the photo. She's looking around the room. She's looking at the photo. She's like, "That's where we're standing. Like where we're standing right now was wall to wall bodies." And that was kind of a very sobering and a very, very harrowing realization to realize that it kind of brought you back to the reality of the situation, that there was no place for these bodies to go, so they had to end up in these buildings, and where we were standing having a great time was a morgue.
Right. Yeah. And so I just mentioned that, I think it's important for us to remember so often when I think it's true of any student of history to realize that history happened to people.
Yeah.
And so when you start talking about, the big flows of history, I remember a conversation here recently talking about the number of Soviets that died in World War II. It's a staggering number.
Oh, yeah.
Civilians plus soldiers, somewhere in the order of 28 to 35 million, depending upon which number you believe. Those numbers actually get so large that we have difficulty personalizing them.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And, part of where I bring that back to, and I don't want to get on a soapbox or feel like I'm preaching here, but as we're in the midst of the COVID situation that we are right now, in the United States, and certainly we know we have our listeners globally, this is a global thing. It's a global pandemic. But the United States just surpassed the 100,000 mark for deaths. It's a sobering number. When I hear that number, I respond to that number. I know a few people indirectly who are direct deaths. Certainly know who they are.
Yeah.
It changes the impact. It's not 100,000.
It totally does.
It's not 100,000. Now it's one.
Mm-hmm.
So again, when you think back to the historical what ifs, there are families out there who have a very different personal what if story. And if you think back through what so often happens in history, there's someone who didn't survive or a descendant of somebody who didn't survive who may have had a larger impact on society.
Yeah.
Every life matters. but may have had a larger impact on society that we'll never know. That's the hidden what ifs of history so often is, what could have been, was there somebody that was on Galveston Island who 10 years ago would have, a descendant of theirs would have come up with a cure for cancer? We don't know.
We don't know.
Those are the hidden what ifs of history. I just want to mention that here because we don't spend a lot of time talking about a natural disaster in our historical what ifs. This is unique in that respect.
Right.
And understanding that natural disasters have impact. I think back to the events of 9/11, which we did sort of talk about. Those were families. Those were people, people that don't have fathers, people that don't have mothers, people that lost sons and brothers and spouses and all the things that go with that. I just want to make sure we point out as a podcast, it's easy for us to talk about the big sweep of history and, 8,000 people, just mentioning as a number. Those are 8,000 individuals. And particularly if you watch some of the documentaries or other, things that have been done just on this storm, the 1900 storm. I think of the orphanage particular situation.
Oh, yeah.
Watch something on that, you will be moved.
Oh, yeah.
Hands down, you will be moved. And I think it's important for those of us that are students of history to not play the parlor game of what if as often as we do, but actually think about what it really meant for somebody's individual what if. So if that feels a little preachy, I'm sorry, but I'm preaching to myself when I say that about thinking through. When we talk about historical what ifs, don't forget the what ifs often involve people.
Yeah, it's so easy to dehumanize history.
Right. And think about it in terms of broad, strokes. Well, those broad strokes are made up of individual brush strokes and individual elements of the brush. So I just want to mention that. I recognize that. I'm thinking about that particularly because this is a story about, as you said, the hurricane is the story. The fact that Houston grows instead of Galveston, okay, that's an interesting thing to think about. But there's a human story, there's a human toll that goes behind the scenes. So, any other thoughts before we close out, Lex?
I think we've pretty much covered it. It's just I mean, as I said, I live in Galveston. I deal with it every day. I drive down the seawall at least once a week, if not more than that. I'm in these places, so again, it is a good reminder to kind of stop and just think about the fact that so many people were affected in these places that I just kind of walk by, drive by, casually interact with. It's a sobering but a good reminder.
Yeah, even thinking about the seawall itself, which is a predominant feature on the island. You can drive down the seawall. I think you discovered the little hidden fact of the sidewalk on the seawalls.
Yeah, apparently the sidewalk on the seawall is the longest in the world.
Yeah. The reason you can't directly walk onto the beach for much of Galveston Island, particularly the east end of the island, which is what's protected by the seawall, is walking directly onto the beach, which might be a nice thing, is a deadly thing.
Right.
In fact, there are stories can be told when my wife was doing her medical studies down there and was working in the emergency rooms. People rode their bikes off of the seawall and fell and came into the emergency room because of that.
People have driven off the seawall.
And why do we have this, 12, 14 foot tall thing? Well, it's because without it, even more people would be at risk or die. So it's just the element of what's there. So again, we thank you for joining us here on A Fork in Time as we conclude the third episode of our 4-part series.
One more to go.
About the impact of weather and particularly hurricanes on history. We hope, I don't know if enjoyed is the right word, I hope you found enlightening, thinking about what would have happened if there had been no great storm of 1900. Would the Galveston that we know today be different than the Galveston that would have arisen? I think the answer is most definitely yes.
Yes, yeah.
There may be, I may be a baseball fan of, maybe they're the Galveston Astros, but maybe they're the Galveston Galaxy because of wanting to have something that's a nice, it's still space themed, but something that's entirely different because Galveston would be that large city and not Houston. That's some of the small things that are there, but some of the real things that are there. So once again, we thank you for joining us here on A Fork in Time. Again, we invite you to visit our the site for the podcast, our website, www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Share us on social media. Spread the word around. If you can support us financially, you'll find our Patreon link there. We talk about it all the time, so we're not going to do it ad nauseum today. Give us the feedback. All the things you can do there on the site. If you haven't visited, I just ask you if you're a regular listener, just once. Just go. Just let us know you're there and give us some feedback, and we sure would appreciate it. So, Lex, anything you want to say as we close out?
I think so. we're obviously not going to tell you what the theme of the last episode is, but I'll give you a little clue. We're going a little further east than Galveston, and not as far forward in history.
Okay, so we're in 1900 now, moving forward, and we're heading east, and we know it's a hurricane, so there's a clue.
We know it's a hurricane.
There's a clue there, so we invite you.
And I might have had a Freudian slip, I'm just saying.
Okay, there you go. Well, you did. You actually did.
I did.
You left a little Easter egg in. Now that I think about it, you left a little Easter egg in the. So if you have to go back and re-listen to the whole episode, that's
find it.
Hey, that's on you. You should have paid more attention the first time. So once again, Alexis and I thank you for joining us today. Hope you come back next time. We do pick up the last installment in this 4-part series, which we hope you've enjoyed, and we'll look forward to seeing you then on A Fork in Time. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.